Welcome back. As President Trump headed to Singapore on Air Force One, he blasted the Canadian Prime Minister. This is the tweet, quote, Justin Trudeau of Canada acted so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left saying that U.S. tariffs were kind of insulting and will not be pushed around. Very dishonest and weak. Our tariffs in response to his 270% on dairy. To weigh in, our talk radio panel, Chris Stigall, heard in the city of brotherly love, where evidently he was able to find his suit jacket finally, and Garland Nixon on the dial here in Washington. Gentlemen, nice to see you. Chris, we know the president's supporters love the tough talk. They love a president who's seen as fighting back either at home or on the world stage, counterpunching, they call it. Do they distinguish between punching at our allies and punching at our adversaries?
It seems like all the right people, if you're a Trump supporter, all the right people are really ticked off this morning. I got to tell you, when you see John McCain saying most of we American voters are globalists, and you see all the foreign heads of states screaming and yelling, I don't know, Leland, the worm has turned a bit, and I think Americans are waking to the fact that all the right people, like I said, seem to be upset. And so while, look, we don't know the details and nothing's in stone, I don't think you're going to find a lot of Americans that say, oh, gosh, we ought to spend more time considering what Canada wants. What's making Canada unhappy?
Well,
it's not really our nature.
On that note, Garland, there were a lot of Democrats you could add to Chris's list of people who were upset this morning. Dianne Feinstein on some of the Sunday shows sort of almost seeming to lose their mind over how the president was treating the Canadians. But the Democrats don't seem to be making any headway off of being so angry about that.
Well, I think the other perspective is this. If we get away from whether or not, which party it's going to be, benefit or the Trump base.
Garland, dare to dream. Find a time in Washington lately that it's not all about which party is going to benefit from something.
So I'm going to try to step above that a little bit and say and say this. One of the things that the chief diplomat has to do for this country or any country is strike deals. The problem I have here is that the president gave his word that he would do something. After he left, he became offended and he went back on his word. Now he's going to Singapore to strike a deal. If there's one thing that international diplomacy requires, it is stability. And I think people are going to look at this and say, well, if we strike a deal with this guy and he gets upset when he leaves, he might change his mind. So I don't think it's in the best interest of the country as far as being able to make deals with our allies or our enemies in the future.
We'll get Chris's response to that quickly. If you listen to the administration, Larry Kudlow on CNN a little bit earlier said this hitting back, if you will, and presenting this front to the Canadian Prime Minister was all about the North Korean deal. Take a listen.
I personally negotiated with Prime Minister Trudeau, who, by the way, I basically liked working with, but not until this sophomoric play. Here's the thing. He really kind of stabbed us in the back.
Question, Chris, for you. Such tough language about the Canadians, but you see what the Chinese are doing, whether it be hacking into our military warfare plans, as they just did with the U.S. Navy, whether it be on ZTE and some of the things that company did, or their other mobile phone companies. We don't see that kind of harsh rhetoric against the president of China. We see it against the president, or the prime minister, rather, of Canada.
Oh, I think Trump has had a lot of harsh rhetoric towards China. Look at what China effectively did to bring us to Singapore. Don't discount how much China had to do with bringing North Korea to the table in this upcoming summit, because they knew Trump was a guy who said...
Did the U.S. give up too much to China to have the Chinese do that?
Oh, I don't know that we've given up anything yet.
The ZTE deal?
Well, but if it means we're sitting down to the table now with North Korea and we're talking about a potential, nuclear summit that could turn into a peace accord for the Korean Peninsula, I don't know, give and take. Something else I'll say, Trump has consistently, much like domestically, when he's talked about, the border situation, all he wants is a secure border, and he's willing to grant the DACA folks, the Dreamer folks, what the Democrats want. They won't secure the border. Similarly with Canada and these other nations. All Trump said, no tariffs, and we'll sign a deal. They won't take a no tariffs deal. Why is that exactly?
All right, Garland, you get the last word if you have an answer for that one.
Well, I think that we're going to see how this affects the upcoming deals. I think what we're looking at now is a lot of countries are going to be looking at the Russias and the Chinas and saying, you know what, maybe making a trade deal with them is more stable. I may not be able to trust them on some things, but at least they're keeping their words on trade, and it's going to hurt us because we are in competition with these countries when it comes to international trade.
We've certainly seen the Chinese expanding in Africa and South America as well, especially down near the Panama Canal. Gentlemen, appreciate both of you being here. Always good to see you, Chris. Suit jacket or not, buddy. We'll see you soon. Looks good. There you go.
Fallout from the G7 summit continues as President Trump again calls out Canada and other key U.S. allies on trade. The president tweeting, "Sorry, we cannot let our friends or enemies take advantage of us on trade anymore. We must put the American worker first." Griff Jenkins is live in Washington. Griff, good morning.
Good morning, Sandra. It appears the president is escalating the start of a trade war with America's closest allies, unleashing a barrage of tweets in the wake of the G7, some aimed at Canada's prime minister, as you mentioned, like this one. He says fair trade is now to be called fool trade if it is not reciprocal. According to a Canada release, they make almost $100 billion in trade with U.S. Guess they were bragging and got caught. Minimum is $17 billion. Tax area from us at 270%, then Justin acts hurt when called out. This all began when the president shook things up in Quebec, but then became furious when Trudeau held a news conference after his departure and said this.
Would be with regret, but it would be with absolute certainty and firmness that we move forward with retaliatory measures on July 1st, applying equivalent tariffs to the ones that the Americans have unjustly applied to us. Canadians, we're polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
That prompting the president to withdraw his agreement to the group's communique and infuriating administration officials with harsh words coming from the president's trade policy advisor, Peter Navarro.
There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door.
And Sandra, the fallout continues with G7 leaders like Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel calling the situation, quote, depressing and vowing tariff retaliation as well. Perhaps one positive note, overnight trading was mostly up in the euro, getting a bounce despite heightened worries over this what would be a...
Robert De Niro set off an S-storm at the Tony Awards by saying F Trump, and the liberal Hollywood crowd giving a standing ovation, cursing out the president. But the coverage of President Trump and what happened at the G7 summit in Quebec, not all that different. I mean, minus the cursing with a little more subtlety. But really, there's a lot of blank Trump notes in the coverage. Now, I'm not saying that what the president did obviously alienated some of America's allies, used very tough talk and personalized the battle over tariff, especially with Justin Trudeau. I'm not saying that's not a huge story. And I'm certainly not saying the president doesn't deserve his share of criticism for the way he handled it. But there seems to be, in some of the straight news stories and among some of the commentators, a sense that the president is not, using his negotiating style to try to protect American workers and get a better deal and maybe in the end he'll compromise. It's just like the guy's unhinged, he's crazy, this is what he does. He's nicer to our adversaries than he is to our allies. And I just wonder whether or not it amounts to a big middle finger. I mean, here's a column in the New York Times by David Leonhardt. Trump tries to destroy the West. Not that he is destroying the West or the old trade order, but he's trying to blow up the Western Alliance. CNBC's John Harwood tweeted, Trump resumes baseless rant against friendly democracy next door. Trump reacted irrationally, and then advisors made stuff up to make it sound like there was a rational basis for his irrationality. It's always fascinating to me the way some of the fiercest critics of President Trump almost fall into the trap of going as overboard as they accuse him of doing when they really get riled up, as they have over the G7 business. Now, there is simply no question. One of the guests on my show the other day said, well, when it comes to covering, world trade and tariffs and the G7, the press oversimplifies it and makes it too personality-based. And there's a lot of truth to that. But how do you not make it personality-based when the President of the United States, after meeting in Canada, goes on this tweet storm when Air Force One goes after Justin Trudeau, says, oh, he acted meek and mild in our discussions, but he's very dishonest and weak. And then after bringing up this 270% Canadian dairy tariff, the President goes on to say, then Justin acts hurt when called out. Look, this is what the President does. Sometimes he goes too far. He personalizes every dispute. He does it with American allies. He does it with some adversaries. He does it with domestic opponents. And he certainly does it with those of us in the news business who he calls fake news journalists. That's his style. Sometimes it works for him. Sometimes it doesn't work so well. So again, absolutely important story to cover, absolutely fair game to criticize the president's style. Why did he jet off to a meeting with dictator Kim Jong-un after picking a huge fight with Canada? It's not to say that, we shouldn't renegotiate tariffs with Canada, but Justin Trudeau was nowhere near as pointed or as critical the president as the president was of him. So now we have the Canadian front in the war on words. But I just think when you get down to reading motivation and saying he wants this, he likes blowing things up. There was a much fairer story in the Washington Post which said President Trump's having the time of his life because he's doing things unilaterally now with allies, on tariffs, with the nuclear summit. And that it seems to be working for him, says the Post, because his poll numbers, as I noted last week, have been going up. A fair approach to the president includes criticism and also includes a perspective from his side. We're seeing a lot less of that in the wake of the train wreck at the G7.